I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. Claire's laugh cut across the dining table like something sharp, bright and deliberate, and aimed directly at me. "Oh, don't pretend, Emma," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to make certain they did. "You're just jealous because Mom loves me more." The table went still. A hush fell over the entire room. Forks stopped moving. Aunt Rose set down her wine glass. Cousins exchanged glances. Mom made a small sound, something between surprise and discomfort, and looked down at her birthday napkin as though it had become very interesting. My chest tightened. My face went warm. The humiliation arrived exactly the way it always did with Claire, fast, public, and dressed up as a joke so that any objection I made would look like overreaction. Jealous. Me. I thought about the months of planning I had put into this dinner. The phone calls to relatives, the reservation, the hours spent on a gift that Claire knew nothing about. I thought about all the times I had absorbed this kind of thing in silence. Then I set my fork down. I smiled, a small, careful, deliberate smile. My name is Emma Hart. And Claire had no idea I wasn't done yet. The favoritism hadn't started recently. It had been building for years, layered and slow, the way water shapes stone. Claire was the younger one, which had always seemed to matter more than it should. She had learned early that a well-timed laugh could do more than an hour of effort. She had learned that Mom responded to performance, to the dramatic entrance, the perfectly phrased compliment, the emotional display delivered at just the right volume. I had learned something different. I had learned to show up without announcement. When Mom's car broke down 3 years ago, I drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm to pick her up. When she went through a difficult patch after Dad retired, it was me she called most nights. When she needed help navigating the hospital after a routine scan came back with something worth watching, I was the one who researched, who made calls, who sat beside her in the waiting room. Claire had sent flowers when the results came back clear. She had posted a photograph on her phone. The flowers were beautiful. The photograph got 20 responses. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because the pattern was real, and I had watched it long enough to understand it completely. The moment after Claire spoke, something shifted inside me. Not rage, not the hot, uncontrolled kind that would have served her perfectly. What I felt was sharper and colder than rage. It was clarity. My fingers had tightened on my wine glass. I felt the pressure of the stem against my palm and used it deliberately, the way you press your foot into the floor to steady yourself. Anger was there, yes. Hurt was there too. But underneath both of those things was something that had been quietly building for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer. I was not jealous. I had never been jealous of Claire. What I had been was patient. Patient in the way that feels, from the outside, like resignation. The entire table was still watching. Aunt Rose with her wine glass suspended. My cousin Pete staring at his plate. Mom with that particular stillness she adopted when she wanted to pretend a moment wasn't happening. I understood, in that instant, that this was my moment. Not to shout. Not to cry. Not to defend myself with words that would only prove Claire's narrative correct. I was going to flip the script entirely, slowly, precisely, and with the patience I had spent years building. The smile stayed on my face. Small. Deliberate. Certain. While Claire recovered her smirk and reached for her wine, I took a quiet inventory of the room. Mom sat at the head of the table, her birthday crown slightly askew, a paper one Pete's daughter had made, gold glitter and all. She looked the way she always did at family gatherings. Pleased but slightly overwhelmed, as though the attention was both wonderful and a little too much. Dad sat across from her, cutting his chicken in the methodical way he did everything since he retired. He had heard Claire's comment. I could tell by the brief pause in his cutting. But Dad had always handled conflict by pretending it wasn't there. Aunt Rose was watching me. She was Mom's older sister, sharp in the way people become when they've stopped being fooled by surfaces. Her expression was careful, not disapproving, but attentive. My cousins, Pete and Nina, were looking at their plates. They were kind people who disliked scenes. This was the room I had to work with. Each person in it was a different kind of audience, responding to different things. I took a breath and adjusted my posture. Shoulders back. Expression open. The stage was already set. I simply needed to perform differently than Claire expected. Weeks earlier, after Mom told me about the birthday dinner, I had sat in my kitchen with a notebook and thought carefully. Not about revenge in the dramatic sense. What I thought about was truth. Specifically, how to let the truth of who I had been to my mother become visible in a room that had always seen Claire first. I wrote down things I remembered. The soup I had made and frozen in labeled containers when Mom had her knee operation. The afternoon I had spent helping her organize 30 years of photographs into albums because she kept saying she wanted to do it someday and someday never arrived on its own. The specific birthday gift I had been planning for weeks. I also wrote down Claire's patterns. The way she entered rooms. The way she directed conversations back to herself. The way she mistook volume for substance and mistook Mom's laughter for love. I am not a manipulative person. But I am observant, and I had spent enough years being invisible in this family to know exactly what made people in it pay attention. The plan was not complicated. It was patient. It would culminate at dessert. I just had to get there. The week before the dinner, I began moving small pieces into place. Aunt Rose was first. I called her on a Tuesday, ostensibly to confirm she was coming. We talked for 40 minutes, mostly she talked, and I listened. Aunt Rose had strong feelings about the birthday cake recipe and whether it should have buttercream or ganache, and I listened to every word with genuine interest because Aunt Rose was interesting when you paid attention. Before we hung up, I mentioned that I had been helping Mom organize her photo albums. Aunt Rose went quiet. She always wanted to do that, she said. I know, I said. We've been working on it together on Sunday afternoons. She has incredible stories for every photograph. Aunt Rose's voice was warmer when we said goodbye. The second piece was the coffee cake. Mom's book club met on Thursdays, and I had offered months ago to make one for their November meeting. Mom had mentioned it to the other members, who had apparently asked about it since. I quietly arranged to bring the same recipe to the birthday dinner. These were not dramatic moves. They were seeds. Patient, deliberate, invisible. Claire had never learned the value of invisible. Claire called me 3 days before the dinner. I was folding laundry when my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of spite, but out of habit. With Claire, the way you entered a conversation mattered. Emma, she said, in the tone she used when performing casual. Are you coming to Mom's dinner or are you going to be weird about it? Weird. That was her word for any behavior of mine she found inconvenient. Of course I'm coming, I said. My voice was easy. I continued folding. Good. A pause. Because I've got something planned that's going to make it really special. I just don't want it to feel crowded. She was warning me, telling me, in the language she had always used, that this was her stage and I was expected to sit quietly in the audience. I'm sure whatever you have planned is lovely, I said. I'll see you there. I could hear her trying to read my tone, searching for jealousy or resentment she could use. She didn't find it. Fine, she said. See you. I set the phone down and smiled at a neatly folded towel. One more day. The night of the dinner, I arrived at Mom's house 12 minutes after the stated time. Not late. 12 minutes is well within the comfortable range for a family gathering. But I was the last to arrive, which meant everyone would notice my entrance. I had thought about what I was wearing. Not extravagantly. I hadn't bought anything new. A deep green dress I owned that fit well and suited the weather. Simple earrings. My hair down. Nothing that announced effort. The kind of thing that reads, to an observant room, as effortless. When I walked in, Mom was at the table talking to Aunt Rose. Dad was carving something near the kitchen counter. Pete and Nina were in conversation with Nina's husband Owen, who was unfailingly polite. Claire was standing near Mom's chair, adjusting the centerpiece she had brought, an elaborate arrangement of white flowers that must have cost considerably. She was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, bright red, and she had had her hair done. She looked lovely. I told her so. You look lovely, Claire, I said, and I meant it, and I watched the tiny flicker of surprise cross her face before her smile reset. That flicker told me everything I needed to know. Complimenting Claire had not been a performance of generosity. It had been a strategic choice, and I want to explain why. Claire had prepared for battle. She had arrived dressed for a competition I wasn't going to enter. She had her centerpiece, her new dress, her prepared remarks. She had assembled herself for a version of this evening in which I was the adversary. When I complimented her genuinely, not with sarcasm, not with thin sweetness that reads as fake, I removed the adversary from the room. I left her with no target. Her competitive energy had nowhere to go. I watched her smile waver. Just slightly. She had expected brittleness or coldness from me. She had not expected warmth. The compliment cost me nothing. The effect on her was immediate. She tried to compliment me back, "You look fine, Emma," which revealed more about the speaker than the recipient. I thanked her pleasantly and moved to say hello to Aunt Rose. Aunt Rose stood when she saw me. She held both my hands. I heard about the photo albums. That was a wonderful thing. Mom looked up from her conversation with Pete, smiling. The evening had begun. Appetizers arrived, the little cheese rounds with jam that Mom had been making for as long as I could remember, and crackers and small vegetables arranged on a plate with the care she always took over small things. I helped her carry plates from the kitchen, which meant a few minutes alone with her before sitting down. She talked about her week, a book she was reading, a neighbor whose cat had gotten into her garden again. I listened and asked questions. When we came back to the table, the atmosphere had warmed. Owen had told a joke that made Pete laugh. Aunt Rose had refilled her wine. I sat down and, during a natural pause, told a story about something that had happened at work. I kept it brief and made it funny, the kind of story that requires good timing and a willingness to make yourself look slightly foolish, which I have always found disarms people more effectively than any impressive anecdote. The table laughed. Not politely, genuinely. I saw Claire glance toward Mom to check her reaction. Mom was still smiling at me. I didn't look at Claire. I had learned the hard way that checking someone's reaction is its own kind of defeat. There is a feeling that comes with being fully present in a room, not performing, not competing, just genuinely engaged, and I had it that evening. I felt it in the steadiness of my own voice, in the ease with which I held eye contact, in the pleasure of making Aunt Rose laugh at something about the cat and garden situation Mom had described, which led to a thread of conversation about neighborhood animal chaos that kept everyone entertained for several minutes. Claire was talking too, describing something, a trip, or a restaurant, and being heard, but the room had a different quality than the one she usually dominated. The attention wasn't fixed on her the way she was used to. She tried an escalation. A funnier story. A louder laugh. I didn't react. I simply continued existing in the conversation I was having, which was the more devastating thing to do. Because the thing Claire had never understood about attention was this: you cannot take it. You can only earn it. The moment you start trying to take it, the room senses it, and the attention shrinks. I had known this since I was 15. Claire, apparently, still hadn't learned it. The main course was served around 7:30. Mom had made her lamb roast, the one she only made for special occasions, slow-cooked since morning until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. It was extraordinary. There was roasted garlic and green beans and a potato dish Aunt Rose had brought. I made a point of asking Mom about the cooking. How long she had left it in. What she had put in the marinade. Not because I didn't know, I had the same recipe at home, but because asking made Mom talk, which she loved, and made the meal feel like a celebration of her. She talked about the lamb for nearly 10 minutes, gesturing with her fork, explaining the specific placement in the oven, the importance of resting it properly. Aunt Rose asked follow-up questions. Dad nodded approvingly. Claire tried to redirect the conversation twice, once with a comment about a restaurant that did better lamb, which landed poorly, and once with a story that lost me by the middle. I didn't interfere. I simply let the conversation find its own level. Its own level was always the same in a room full of people paying honest attention. Over dinner, I mentioned the gift. Not loudly, not dramatically. I leaned toward Mom during a quiet moment and said, "I have something for you tonight. Nothing extravagant, just something I think you'll like." Mom's face brightened. "You didn't need to do anything." "I know," I said. But I wanted to. Across the table, I saw Claire's eyes flick to me. A narrowing. A recalculation. She didn't know what the gift was. She had no way of knowing, because I hadn't told anyone. I had mentioned it to Aunt Rose during our phone call, only that I had something planned, but I hadn't described it. The not knowing was, I had calculated, more unsettling for Claire than any description could have been. Claire liked to be prepared. She liked to know what she was competing against so she could position herself accordingly. Without that information, she had no position to take. I watched her try to re-enter the conversation about the gift by asking, with studied casualness, "What did you get, Emma?" "You'll see," I said pleasantly. Then I turned back to Aunt Rose and resumed what we had been discussing before. I heard Claire's fork make a small, sharp sound against her plate. Aunt Rose leaned close to me during the second half of the main course. "Your mother talks about those Sunday afternoons," she said quietly. "Does she?" I said. "She told me, 2 months ago, that they were her favorite part of the week. Going through all those old pictures. Remembering things." Aunt Rose paused, swirling her wine gently. She said it felt like someone had given her time back. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, I hadn't been anxious. More like the quiet confirmation that something real had been real. "I think she has extraordinary stories," I said. "She should write them down." Aunt Rose looked at me with an expression that was direct and warm. "You're a good daughter, Emma," she said. "Better than you give yourself credit for." "I give myself appropriate credit," I said, which made her laugh. Across the table, Pete was asking Dad something, Claire was speaking to Nina, and the room had the comfortable distributed quality of a dinner going well. Mom caught my eye from her end of the table. She smiled at me. Not the big birthday smile she wore for the room. The other one. The private one. The table was cleared for dessert and there was that particular shift in atmosphere that happens in the space between a meal and its ending. Everyone a little more relaxed, voices warmer, all the formality fully dissolved. This was the moment I had been building toward for weeks. Not from revenge, exactly. What I was operating from was a place of truth. I had spent years being the daughter who showed up quietly and left without acknowledgement, and I had decided that quiet showing up was no longer something I would keep doing without allowing it to be visible. The gift was on the sideboard behind me, where I had placed it when I arrived. A flat box, wrapped simply. Nothing elaborate. Inside it were 142 photographs, printed and arranged in a handmade album I had spent 3 weekends putting together. Each photograph had a small note beside it, a memory, a detail, a connection I had observed or Mom had shared with me during those Sunday afternoons together. Claire's centerpiece of white flowers was beautiful. It had been the first thing anyone noticed when they sat down. What I had brought was something nobody had seen yet. And it was time. I excused myself from the table for a moment. I went to the kitchen, checked on the coffee cake I had brought and slid into Mom's oven to warm, then came back carrying the gift box. The table noticed immediately. Pete sat up slightly. Aunt Rose turned. Even Dad, who had been in quiet conversation with Owen, glanced over. Claire noticed too. Her eyes tracked from the box to my face and back to the box. I could see her calculating, trying to estimate size, trying to understand what it could be, trying to assess how significant it was going to be. I set the box on the table in front of Mom. "Happy birthday," I said. Just that. No speech, no preamble. Mom looked at the box, then at me, with the soft expression she wore when genuinely moved by something rather than performing being moved. "Should I open it now?" she asked. "If you like," I said. I sat back down. I folded my hands in my lap. My posture was relaxed, open, and entirely unhurried. Claire had gone very still beside her water glass. The table was quiet, not uncomfortable, but the held breath kind that happens when something real is about to occur. Mom opened the box slowly. She took her time with the wrapping, as she always did, saving the paper rather than tearing it, smoothing it as she went. When she lifted the cover of the album and saw the first page, she stopped. The first photograph was one from her childhood, Mom at 7 years old, sitting in a garden, holding a cat the same way her neighbor's cat now tormented her own garden. Below it was a note in my handwriting. You told me this cat's name was Biscuit and that he ate more flowers than any creature had a right to. Mom made a sound. A very quiet sound. She turned the page. The next photograph was from her wedding. Then a camping trip when Claire and I were small. Then a photograph of a house she had loved and not bought. Then her parents. Then a friend she had mentioned once with a particular softness. Each photograph had a note. Not long, a sentence or two, capturing the specific detail she had told me, the exact thing she had said about that moment that made it hers. The table was very still. Aunt Rose had tears in her eyes. Mom said, "I can't believe you remembered all these." Her voice was low and rough. She turned another page and stopped at a photograph of herself at a concert, young and laughing, wearing a jacket I had never seen her wear. "You told me about that jacket once," I said. "You found it at a market and wore it everywhere for 2 years until it fell apart. You said it was the most comfortable thing you had ever owned." Mom looked up at me. "I haven't thought about that jacket in 20 years. "I know," I said. "That's why I wrote it down." She put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Claire shifted in her chair. I became aware of her without looking, a kind of peripheral awareness, the way you sense weather changing. Aunt Rose said something soft to the person beside her. I heard the word beautiful. Dad had put down his napkin. He was looking at the album with the expression he wore when something surprised him into feeling something he hadn't planned to feel. Mom turned another page and laughed suddenly, a real laugh, at a photograph of a spectacularly failed pie. I had written, "You said it tasted like ambition and sadness in equal parts." The table laughed with her. I waited for the laughter to settle before speaking. "I wanted you to have a record of your own stories," I said, looking at Mom. "Not just the photographs. The stories behind them. Because you have better ones than anyone I know." Mom set the album down and looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she stood up and came around the table and hugged me with the full, uncomplicated warmth that she didn't always manage in larger groups. "Emma," she said into my shoulder. "Just my name, the way you say something when no adequate words exist for the thing you mean." I hugged her back. When she returned to her seat, Claire began to say something. I didn't catch the beginning. I was focused on the album as Mom reached to turn another page, but the tone was familiar. The recovering tone. "I was going to do something like that," Claire said. "I actually had an idea for." "Let Mom look," I said. Pleasant. Not sharp. Simply redirecting. Mom was already absorbed in the next page, tracing a photograph with one finger, murmuring something to Aunt Rose who had leaned over to look. Claire did not finish her sentence. A moment later, Nina said something I have thought about many times since. She was speaking to Owen in a low voice, but the table was quiet enough that her words carried. "Emma always notices the little things," she said. She's always been that way." Owen nodded. "You can really tell." It wasn't directed at Claire. Not intended as a comparison or a rebuke. Just the honest observation of someone watching the evening unfold. But Claire heard it. I saw it land. I watched the small tightening around her eyes, the particular expression of someone who has understood that the room has shifted and doesn't know how to respond to the new arrangement. She had come to this dinner prepared to be the center of it. She had spent years having that belief confirmed by a certain kind of surface attention. What she had not accounted for was a different kind of attention. Slower. Quieter. The kind that doesn't respond to performance but does respond to truth. The room was looking at me now. Not exclusively. Mom was still reading the album, Aunt Rose was talking warmly, but the gravitational center had shifted. Claire reached for her wine. Claire made a toast. It was the move I had anticipated, perhaps the most predictable play in her repertoire. When losing ground, declare a moment. She stood up and lifted her glass and said she wanted to say something about Mom, about how wonderful she was, about how lucky the family was to have her. The words were fine. The sentiment was real enough. But there was an edge of desperation in the performance that a careful ear could hear. She said, at the end, that she had always been Mom's biggest support. Her favorite person to call, her closest companion, the one who was always there. She didn't say it as a comparison to me. She didn't need to. We all understood what it was. I looked at Mom while Claire spoke. There was love there, of course there was. There was also a slight tension around her eyes. A careful, held quality. When Claire finished, the table raised their glasses. I raised mine too. I did not look at Claire with any particular expression. I looked at Mom and smiled, the warm, private smile, and I held my glass toward her. Mom held hers toward me. The room noticed. After the toast, I told a story. Not a big story. A quiet one. About a morning 6 months ago when Mom had called me at 7:30 because she was worried about something she'd read in the news and needed someone to talk her through it. We had been on the phone for almost an hour. By the end, she was laughing, because I had told her a fairly ridiculous anecdote about a seagull and a parking attendant that had nothing to do with the news and everything to do with breaking the spell of anxiety. She called me back that afternoon, I said, to tell me the seagull story had been stuck in her head all day. Mom laughed. I told 3 people about that seagull. You told me you told 3 people, I said. Which means you definitely told more. At least 5, Aunt Rose said knowingly. The table was warm and easy. Pete was laughing. Owen had relaxed entirely into his chair. Dad had the expression he wore when pleased in a way he wasn't going to comment on directly. Claire had gone quiet in the way that is louder than noise. She was still at the table, still present, but her presence had contracted, pulled inward, become smaller than the room. The coffee cake came out of the oven just as the conversation was beginning to drift toward the comfortable ending stage of a good dinner. I brought it to the table on the board Mom used for things that came out of the oven. Worn, darkened at the edges from years of use, the kind of kitchen object that is more memoir than tool. The smell reached the table before I did. Coffee and cinnamon and the particular warmth of something baked with care. Is that your coffee cake? Aunt Rose said immediately. Mom's coffee cake, technically, I said. Her recipe. I just made it. Mom pressed her hand to her chest. You didn't tell me you were bringing this. I wanted it to be a surprise, I said. I began slicing and passing plates, which meant moving around the table, a word with Pete, a small exchange with Owen, a touch on Aunt Rose's shoulder. I set the last slice in front of Claire without ceremony. Our eyes met. I smiled at her. Not with triumph. Not with cruelty. Just calmly, the way you look at someone when you have nothing to hide and nothing to prove. She looked away first. Claire tried once more to recover the evening. I had expected this, not the specific shape of it, but the attempt. She was too proud to leave without trying to reclaim something. She spoke about the centerpiece, explaining the flower arrangement in more detail than anyone had requested. Then she told a story about Mom, a slightly embellished version of a family holiday from years ago, told with increasing energy, as though volume could accomplish what attention had not. The table listened politely. Mom nodded. But the room's quality had set. Attention, once given authentically, is difficult to redirect through force. When she finished, the table was pleasant and warm and unchanged. Mom looked at the album again. She had been returning to it throughout the evening, turning pages, occasionally sharing a note with Aunt Rose. Emma, she said, not looking up. Did I ever tell you what your grandfather said the day I graduated? Tell me now, I said. And she did. While the coffee cake was eaten and wine glasses slowly emptied, Mom talked, really talked, drawn out by a book I had made from the fragments she had trusted me with. Claire was quiet the entire time. Later, when most people had said goodbyes and the house had relaxed into the soft quiet of an evening ending well, I helped Mom carry plates to the kitchen. We worked side by side without needing to say much. She washed, I dried. The way we had done it when I was small. That album, she said after a while. I said. I don't know how long it must have taken. A few weekends, I said. I enjoyed it. She stopped washing and looked at me. Her eyes were still slightly bright at the edges. I want you to know something, she said. You don't have to. I want to. She turned back to the sink. I know how things can seem sometimes. With Claire and me. I know I don't always make the balance clear. Mom, I said. Let me finish. She handed me a glass. I see you, Emma. I have always seen you. I'm not always as good at showing it as I should be. But I want you to know that I see you. I dried the glass carefully. Outside, I could hear Claire saying goodbye to Aunt Rose on the porch. I set the glass down and hugged my mother. I know, I said. Happy birthday, Mom.